The following interview is with Dr. John Logsdon. Dr. Logsdon is the founder and former director of George Washington University's Space Policy Institute. Alongside his work at the Institute, Dr. Logsdon was also professor at George Washington's Elliott School of International Affairs. Dr. Logsdon is a member of the board of directors of the Planetary Society, a former member of the NASA Advisory Council, and a prolific author on the subject of space exploration. His research efforts focused on the history and policy of U.S. and international space activities. He now joins the Generation Senior Researcher PAN on the subject of the militarization of space. This series is promoting the charity Tab for a Cause. If you're interested in supporting solutions to international issues with a simple Chrome extension, please click the link in the video description.
Before we start with today's questions, could you share with us a little bit about what you do in your field?
What I do?
Yes.
Well, I have specialized in writing about the top-level decisions, particularly by presidents, that have shaped the U.S. space program, more civilian than military. But as someone teaching and talking about space activities, I've had kind of a close-in but outsider view of those activities for the past 50 or so years.
Wow. Can you define or give us a little insight as to what the weaponization of space means?
Well, it's a tricky term, and I think it's important to understand what it means and what it doesn't mean. First of all, space has been militarized since almost day one. I mean, the first space program that President Eisenhower approved after Sputnik was an intelligence satellite called Corona. So space has been used in a non-aggressive, non-weapons basis from day one until today, and we really could not fight a war without the military use of space. Weapons indicate to me the delivery of some form of force or other negative impact on a target. So fortunately to date, space has not been weaponized. There have been no armed battles in space. One country has not formally attacked another's objects in space. The attempt to station weapons in space during the Strategic Defense Initiative actually didn't go anywhere. So, and you also have to say, where is the weapon? Is the weapon on the ground or is the weapon in orbit? And where's the target?
Right.
The target on the ground, the target passing through space, or the target itself in orbit. So it's a rather complex mixture to say space weapon. One more wrinkle. I don't know whether any of your young listeners are hunters or otherwise sportsmen that use a rifle or a gun. Is a gun sight a part of a weapon? Because after all, we use global positioning satellites to guide precision weapons to bombs to their target. So does that make GPS, which we use every day, a weapon? So
right.
it's a really a slippery concept to define.
Right. That is very true. There are so many types of weapons, right? And then different space, different realms. But when we talk about the weaponization of space, specifically, when would you define the history? When did it really begin?
Well, technically, it hasn't begun.
It hasn't begun.
If you say there are no weapons currently deployed, but both the United States and the Soviet Union during the 1960s considered the development of space weapons, of anti-satellite weapons, mainly ground-based systems that could launch from the ground and hit a orbiting weapon. The United States had a program called 437, Program 437, during the mid-1960s, and actually deployed test weapons, but never used them. And then decided it was a bad idea and didn't pursue it. Presumably, and maybe more than presumably, since our intelligence was pretty good, the Soviet Union was doing the same thing. The idea recurred again in the 70s, and President Carter in the 70s wanted to initiate international discussions on a treaty to ban anti-satellite weapons. In the 80s, there was, of course, Strategic Defense Initiative, and we can come back to that, but the United States also developed a weapon launched from the wing of an F-15 fighter, and actually tested it once against an object in orbit. And so, you know, was that weaponization? So the idea of developing and deploying space weapons has been with us for many, many years.
Right, right. So it's the idea has been there, but maybe not the actualization of weaponization, right?
Not so far.
Not so far, right. So since space is important economically and militarily, what treaties are in place that really regulate what states can or cannot do in their space?
Well, I mean, there are a body of treaties passed by the UN in the late 60s and early 70s. There are 5 treaties that are generally considered to be the basic law of outer space, which say very little about weapons. They say you cannot deploy a weapon of mass destruction in orbit. And they say that you cannot deploy weapons of mass destruction on celestial bodies. But they don't deal with anything other than weapons of mass destruction. So basically there is, and then there are more fundamental legal provisions like the right of self-defense, the basic UN Charter, which preserves the right of self-defense. And I think both the United States and the Soviet Union, now Russia, have said that any testing or any development they have of systems that could be considered weapons are to prepare for self-defense. So there is no binding international agreement that prevents most of what today we would consider space weapons.
Right, right. And since they're not binding, right, and these treaties that regulate the behaviors and the conducts among states, do you think these treaties really work? Does there need to be an enforcement mechanism when it comes to your behaviors, your strategies? And if so, what would that entail? What would that entail or look like? Yeah.
Well, you know, that's a question that has to do with international law in general.
Right.
Are there means of enforcing international law? And there are. You can take a dispute to the International Court of Justice, and the International Court of Justice can put forward a ruling and a penalty. But most of the time, and for most international law, it's somewhat self-enforcing. It sets a standard of behavior, of good conduct, that it's in the interest of most countries most of the time to behave according to the rules. So they are rules with, you know, and ultimately, if there's a violation of the rules, including space weapons, you can go to the Security Council of the United Nations and get authorization of a response, including a military response to a violation of a rule. So, you know, there is some teeth in the existing regime.
And do you think there needs to be such an enforcement mechanism to make it even more regulated? Do you
No,
think?
I mean, the enforcement mechanism is itself a threat to the peaceful character of space activities. So, I mean, do you like the idea of a police force in space with explicit provisions for enforcement mechanisms? Now, our policy, the U.S. space policy, says that we reserve the right, if there's interference with our space activities, we reserve the right to retaliate. So there is the threat of retaliation already in existence.
Right. So it's more like mutually regulating among the states, but not the international, not from the perspectives of the international law.
Well, not for the perspective of an international institution or an international mechanism. I mean, there is no international police force except those authorized under the United Nations. And how that would work with respect to a space conflict is a pretty tricky issue.
That's right. Was Reagan's SDI program a feasible plan? Do you think so in the 80s? And did it succeed? Did it fail? What do you think?
Well, was it a feasible plan?
Was it a feasible plan? Yeah.
Now, again, the idea of SDI was to station weapons in space to be able to intercept a warhead, a nuclear warhead, as it passed through space. So it was a space-based weapon attacking something passing through space, but not stationed in space. So that's a particular category. We didn't get far enough along in the testing of the space-based elements of SDI to know whether it would have been feasible. By the time of the end of the Cold War and the agreements between the United States and the collapsing Soviet Union to kind of turn down their nuclear forces, the need for something like SDI more or less disappeared. So the program didn't get far enough along to really determine whether its space-based elements would have been feasible.
That's interesting. And how do you think that program has changed the following administration's plan?
Well, I mean, again, it has almost, SDI has almost nothing to do with the current debate on space weaponization, which is really attacking objects in space, not objects passing through space. Whether they're ground-based or space-based weapons, the debate now is the possibility of attacks on objects in space, in orbit, and so it's a different debate than SDI.
Right. So it doesn't.
SDI more or less faded away. There's still some people who think some form of defense against ballistic missiles that's based in space is a good idea, but that's kind of on the back burner. The issue now is that the United States has made space assets essential to our ability to fight and win a war. And so if one of our opponents wants to enter into conflict with us, one of the prime targets would be our space systems. And basically the same thing goes for at least our strategic adversaries, Russia or China, not so much the second-tier countries like North Korea or Iran. So, I mean, it's a question of we've made space essential to our security, made the ability to use space, and so that utility is threatened by others developing a variety of capabilities. The jargon word is counter space, capabilities to interfere with our space systems in times of conflict.
Right, right. It's almost like a counterattack mechanism in place.
Yeah, or you know, we the U.S. military. That's not me. The U.S. military and civilian national security people kind of constantly carry out war games in which they simulate on a non-active basis what would happen in particular scenarios. And many of those scenarios have an initial attack on space systems from an adversary, kind of blinding us or disabling us so that we would have a hard time conducting military operations.
Right. So what do we currently really know about the U.S. Space Force? And what is the assumed current military capacity and goals?
Well, you can get lots of different explanations of what the Space Force is all about. The semi-benign explanation is that inside the Air Force, space was not getting high enough priority compared to airplanes and missiles.
Right.
And so the idea to create a separate Space Force was to give a higher level of attention in developing and preparing for the space elements of a future conflict. The less benign, and so it was just in a sense, a shuffling of organizations to give higher attention to the development and testing and readiness of the space elements of our existing capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
The less benign explanation is that by creating a separate force dedicated to fighting and winning a war, in preparing to fight and win a war in space, you almost implicitly give more attention to the ability to have armed conflict, to treat space as as the military is saying these days, a war-fighting domain, and so it increases the possibility of weapons being used in outer space, including the in a sense most threatening are debris-creating weapons that would clutter up orbit, make the orbits unusable, and that would be a bad thing for everybody.
Right. And do you think we have the current military capacity to achieve our perhaps goals that we perceived as the future weaponization or the future attack?
Well, I can't talk with any authority about our current capabilities because most of them are highly classified.
Right.
And
that is true.
And so, we have signaled to our adversaries, don't mess with us,
Mm-hmm.
because the consequences of messing with us are worse for you. It's kind of traditional deterrence approach. If you hurt me, I'll hurt you back, and even worse. So we have signaled that we have the capabilities to do that. We have not explicitly tested, again, so-called kinetic kill weapons, things that do create debris. That China has tested that kind of weapon back in 2007. But there are other kinds of weapons. There are lasers, there's cyber attack, there are ways of blinding satellites, there are proximity operations where one spacecraft comes up and maybe squirts paint on the optics of another one. So I think it's safe to assume that the United States, China, Russia, at a minimum, all have capabilities to do damage to space objects.
Wow. And just to clarify, Dr. Logsdon, so the goals of our current military, current Space Force, it is to really get our adversaries be alarmed that we have such capabilities, even though we don't classify what it is. And to, right, go ahead, sorry.
I'm going to be a little nerdy here. The Space Force develops, procures, and trains space forces. It does not operate them in the time of conflict. There's a separate organization that actually is the war fighting organization called the Space Command, which is not part of the Space Force, which is a separate joint command under the military and there are several such war fighting commands. So we have a Space Command. So the Space Force supplies the Space Command with its capabilities. It does not use those capabilities itself. It just develops and tests and trains people to use it. So I'd say that's kind of a nerdy distinction, but it is the Space Command that would actually fight a space war. Right.
That's very interesting. I mean, it is nerdy, but it does help to understand a different organization, a separate office that is in charge.
So, I mean, the point is with creation of the Space Force is a decision which originated in the U.S. Congress. It did not originate with the current president, although he is clearly seized on it. That space capabilities were so important to the pursuit of a future war that they should have their own organization. And you can argue both sides of that, but the Space Force is in the process of creation. Right now, there are not very many people, but lots of people are transferring from the Air Force to the Space Force. There's I think a $15 billion budget request. So within a few years, it could be a very substantial military organization.
Right. And Dr. Logsdon, I think you might have mentioned this a little bit before, but I'm probably going to ask you again, how is Space Force different from the U.S. Air Force space operations?
Well, once the Space Force is totally stood up, those elements of the Air Force that developed, research, development, procurement, buying the equipment, training people to use it, will be the responsibility of the Space Force.
Right.
The actual use of the equipment will still be the responsibility of the Space Command, which will primarily be staffed by Air Force people. So the warfighting capability will remain with the Air Force, while the preparation for warfighting will be the Space Force.
Wow, it is very interesting. So, and they do have differences. Do we currently have any public known methods of protecting American satellites? Because you mentioned satellites before a little bit. As an
I mean, that's the whole point, is protecting the satellite capability. I mean, we use satellites in military terms for communication, for locating targets, for damage assessment. So the ability to have a military operation depends on the use of satellites. And so you want to protect those satellites. So your question is, do we have methods of doing that? Well, our satellites are hardened electronically against electronic interference. They have some ability to maneuver. So if they can see a weapon coming, they can more or less duck. But the primary way of protecting them is the threat of retaliation if you should interfere or attack them.
Could you clarify harden that you mentioned before? Harden, is that right? Right. Could you specify again, please?
Well, I mean, you can design electronic systems so that they are resistant to, like the radiation from a nearby nuclear explosion. You know, if you exploded a small nuclear weapon near one of our key satellites, if the electronics were not protected, hardened against the radiation impacts
Right.
of that nuclear explosion, they could be disabled. So it's a technique for, and the specifics again are pretty well classified, of protecting the systems in your satellites or in your equipment against particular radiation, electronic radiation, attacks from high power electronic beams, maybe against laser attacks. So all of those, that's why the equipment is so expensive.
Right. And Dr. Logsdon, you mentioned before that we can probably anticipate in the future that China, the US, and Russia will be in this, what I would probably call the theater of space competition or even space attack. So what do analysts assume that China's goals are in space? What do you think?
Well, China's goals in space overall are to challenge, to compete with the United States for leadership in both scientific, civilian, commercial, and military sectors. China is on a slow but steady path to space power. And the United States has been, over the years, the leader in space power. Soviet Union challenged us, and at least in the civilian side, we persevered. So China wants to be or the leading space power in the world, believing that space power is an important element of national power. And China clearly wants to be, by mid-century, the leading world power, and has come to the conclusion that space capability is an important element of that.
Right. And do you think they have signaled any part of the plans to incorporate their militarism? Have they?
Well, there's no doubt from what we know publicly that China has developed significant military space capabilities. And as I say, 13 years ago, China tested a kinetic kill space anti-satellite system by destroying one of its own satellites. So you can figure if they could do that 13 years ago, they haven't stood still since then. There have been, again, in the trade press, reports of other forms of Chinese testing of anti-satellite capabilities, laser blinding, that there have been Chinese objects in orbit nearby US objects, so-called proximity operations, that could lead in a conflict to being able to be nearby and attack. So even on an unclassified basis, I think one can say with some confidence that China has kind of a full spectrum of military counter space capabilities. There's an organization called Secure World Foundation, based in Colorado in the United States, that publishes and has updated a directory of counter space capabilities of the spacefaring countries. And it's an interesting catalog of all the things that are already in existence, based only on public information, not on trying to get behind the walls of classification. So this stuff is real.
Right. Could you repeat the organization again that you mentioned in Colorado?
Secure World Foundation.
Thank you.
You know, they're doing that. Their goal is to keep space a peaceful arena open to everyone for peaceful uses. And so things like creating space debris or crowding orbits or other issues that would reduce the ability to operate in space are things that they work hard to avoid.
That's very interesting. Do you think they somehow do have some international influence to, because we mentioned the mechanism before, or international institutions. Do you think this will be a sort of international institutions in the making? Do they have influence?
Well, I think they do have influence. The foundation has been in existence. It's a privately funded foundation by some people in Colorado that wanted to use their wealth to keep space peaceful and open for everybody to use. Right. They are very active internationally. Take a look. Their website is SWFound, SecureWorldFoundation.org. They're all over the world. They're active in the United Nations, in multilateral discussions of space security. So there is a growing international community concerned with space security, of which they're one of the leading organizations.
Wow. So it seems like it is becoming increasingly sort of an international concern regarding
very much so.
Peace and security.
And one should add, to be fair, that both the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and China have repeatedly introduced in the UN Committee on Disarmament a treaty to ban weapons in outer space. And the United States has so far resisted negotiations on such a treaty on the grounds that the draft treaties really would not be effective. So I mean, it's an issue of concern on a global basis.
Do you think this should be perhaps a concern for the next presidential candidate for the U.S. this year?
Well,
it should be.
It's not an issue of concern for one of the candidates. The current president. Mr. Biden has not said much about space in his campaign so far, but certainly the Democratic Party has been the more internationalist, more global negotiations, political perspective historically, and I think that if Mr. Biden were to win on November the 3rd, that he's much more likely to pursue these international discussions than Mr. Trump during a second term.
Right.
I'm trying hard not to be totally political here.
I understand. But
reality is reality.
It is clear. That one party has more, perhaps the agenda on international concerns than the other, or presidential candidates specifically.
I think that's fair to say.
Right. Dr. Logsdon, so that concludes all of our questions today for the interview. Thank you very much for your illuminating talk. I think we've learned so much about the International Space Program from you, and perhaps the international concern in the future. Would you like to say something to perhaps the audience who would like to know more about the space program internationally? Maybe in general, where should we go, from now on?
Sure. Well, I mean, first, we're now, it's October of 2020. So we've been in space since Sputnik in October of 1957. So what is that, 63 years? 3 years. And unlike land, sea, and air, space to date has been free from armed conflict in the space environment. And it would be, I think, in everyone's interest to keep it that way. Because armed conflict in space would threaten the ability for us to use space for essential services of navigation, positioning, timing, environmental monitoring, national security observations, communications. Space has become very valuable to us. So keeping the space environment weapons free, because it's hard to coexist with space debris. I mean, if there was a lot of debris as a result of conflict in space, it could really threaten the ability to use that environment for all the benefits that we get from our space capabilities. So I think the organization that has the lead in that concern is the one I've mentioned, Secure World Foundation. And one can search for that. They have a very good website with lots of resources. There is a committee on the peaceful uses of outer space that's part of the United Nations. And one could be aware of what discussions they have been having on space sustainability and keeping space in an environment for everyone to use. And there are discussions happening around the world on an ad hoc or regular basis related to that. So, a search for under space security will turn up a lot of organizations that if you want to go further, will give you the resources to do that.
Please do, Dr. Logsdon. Thank you very much. I think this is very important information, and it certainly is one significant issue that we all have to keep in mind, right? For the time being, that you're right, space should remain weapons free, unlike other territories that we've.
Well, and it's in a sense historically, it's remarkable that it has remained weapons free for 63 years, and let's hope we can keep it that way.
Right, we should keep it that way. Thank you so much, Dr. Logsdon. I think our interview is finished right now, and I would like to thank you again for attending our interview. Would you like to? I think we already have your contact, right? So
yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So you mentioned before that there are more resources that we could look at. Would you mind keep letting us know if there are resources, or maybe there are other people that
again, the best resource is the website of the Secure World Foundation.
Absolutely.
Which has many resources on its own and links to a lot of other material.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Logsdon.
You're welcome.